It's Wednesday, it's 12:15 and we're live at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool.
Save the winter fuel! Save the winter fuel!
Conference votes to reverse cuts to the winter fuel payment. But Keir Starmer says there's more pain to come.
This is going to be tough. There are difficult decisions along the way, and I need to level with you about how difficult it will be. But there's a purpose. There is light at the end of the tunnel.
We're sending crack teams of top clinicians to hospitals across the country to roll out reforms developed by surgeons to treat more patients and cut waiting lists.
Can the NHS be fixed with reform, or does it need more money? And amidst accusations that government ministers are killjoys, this.
One of the other things that gave me great joy as a kid, as well as the football obviously, was the flute. Don't think you're expecting that, were you?
Joining me today, Health and Social Care Secretary Wes Streeting, Zoe Billingham, Director of the centre-left think tank IPPR North, Liam Thorpe, Political Editor for the Liverpool Echo, and Lara Spirit, Political Correspondent from The Times. This is Politics Live. Well, hello everyone. It's the last day of the Labour Party conference. There may be some noise behind us because they are dismantling the stands and the stalls as we sit here, but it'll all be part of the atmosphere. Our guests will just have to put up with it. We've heard inside the hall they've been singing the anthem, the Labour Party anthem, the red flag, and I think I might be able to hear strains of Jerusalem. I'm not entirely sure, but there is a feeling that everything is wrapping up here. There are still people here listening and watching here on the set, and as I say, everybody is welcome. Let's start with Keir Starmer's speech from yesterday, the big moment when the Prime Minister addressed the party faithful, and a flavour in some of the newspapers. Let's start with The Times. Brace for the incoming storm, warns Starmer. This is how the Mirror are covering it on the front page. Tough love, and there he is with his wife Victoria, but the tough love, of course, is for the country. And let's have a look at the Daily Telegraph. The state will take back control. Yes, the theme, much of it during the speech, was one of a shared endeavour, of sacrifice and pain, but we're told it'll all be worth it. My opening question, starting with you, Wes Streeting, is: have you and have the Labour government got enough political capital to take the country with you?
I think so, and I think the Prime Minister coming into this conference wanted to build on the work he'd done over the summer, explaining why we need to fix the foundations of the economy and our country, but wanted to set out the house you build on top of those more solid foundations. And I think he did that with his speech that had vision, that had hope, but was also really honest about the choices, the trade-offs that are involved in building a path to that better future. We were given a mandate for change and we will deliver.
Well, you say it was a mandate for change, but let's have a look at the statistics before I ask everybody else, because Labour won just 35% of the vote. Yes, a landslide in seats. In an election where only 3 in 5 voted, the elections expert John Curtis said that consequently the pool of voters willing to give the Labour government the benefit of the doubt is unusually small, and the personal ratings of Keir Starmer have already fallen. So I ask just again, where's the evidence that you've got that capital to bring a country along on service, sacrifice and pain?
Well, 2 things. Firstly, we've got a thumping parliamentary majority to deliver the change. And secondly, we've got a Prime Minister who is showing grit, determination and leadership to move us away from government by gimmick, from sticking plaster politics, to actually do what his Conservative predecessors failed to do, which is genuinely deliver the change that will build a brighter future for our country. And that's what the Prime Minister set out in his speech yesterday.
All right. Lara, do you think there is the political capital there? Will people go on this journey?
Well, it's a very interesting question because I think Labour here have been dealing with a problem of timing, actually, if you look at it, because they won the election. We then had quite a long summer recess. We're now in a conference recess. Parliament hasn't really been sitting for that long in these first 100 days of the government. But most importantly here, we haven't had the budget yet. So we're hearing a lot about tough choices and difficult decisions that are going to come. But we're not able to judge on whether or not people are going to tolerate these because we don't actually know substantively what they are yet. And that's, I think, the problem and something that all of us are going to have to wait for.
Liam?
Yeah, conference has come at an awkward time, hasn't it? Because you had the manifesto, the election win. We know what's in the manifesto. It was very difficult to announce anything beyond that, then ahead of the budget. So I was, expecting much of what Starmer said yesterday. It's a lot of the kind of rhetoric we've heard before about that long-term renewal. My concern for Labour is how you might only get one go at this. And after 5 years, will people feel better? Will they feel better off? Will enough change have been made because that coalition is a bit fragile?
What do you think, Zoe? Because there wasn't that much detail about how the country is going to get there.
Yeah, firstly, I'll just say on voter turnout, I do think, we saw a fall in voter turnout at this general election, and I think the government should be working to improve that in the longer term. Of the votes they did get, they do have a thumping majority, and I think the real risk is that they don't use that effectively, actually, to deliver the change that the country so needs. As you say, the speech yesterday was slightly light on policy detail, and it seems like we are going to have to wait till budget to see, what they're going to do on investment, what they're going to do on taxes, and what they're going to do, all importantly, on those fiscal rules that gives the government the headspace, the necessary headspace to make the investments that this country needs.
Right, well, let's just have a listen to something that's just happened, actually, in the last hour or so here in conference, inside the hall, and it is this row that has been raging, particularly here, over the government's decision to cut winter fuel payments to millions of pensioners. Sharon Graham, who is the General Secretary of Unite Union and a delegate, were in a debate just before that vote, which was won by Sharon Graham and supporters to reverse that decision. But let's take a listen to this.
Friends, people simply do not understand. I do not understand how our new Labour government can cut the winter fuel allowance for pensioners and leave the super rich untouched. This is not what people voted for. It's the wrong decision and it needs to be reversed.
But conference, really, do we want to pay 25% of millionaires the money that could go to children? We've been talking about children poverty. Now we're talking about people like myself who do not need the £200 every single year.
Well, both sides of the debate there, but as I say, Sharon Graham and her supporters won that debate. It won't change government policy, but the question, Wes, we're just talking about can you take the country with you? You can't even take conference with you.
Well, hang on a second. We should not lose sight of the fact that we came into government to find a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. Unlike our Conservative predecessors, we are not going to duck those difficult choices, pretend that you can just ratchet up borrowing and you can play fast and loose with the public finances. Keir Starmer was clear in opposition and now clear in government.
Why haven't you persuaded? Yeah, but why haven't you persuaded Sharon Graham? These are choices. She said, "I can't believe a new Labour government is doing this." If you can't persuade her and you can't persuade the majority of people here, how can you persuade the country?
Well, and I say this with great respect and affection for Sharon Graham, so I do have a lot of respect for her. Can we set the bar of expectations in the right place? I'm not sure we're ever going to persuade Sharon. And look, the thing about delegates to party conference, whether they're from our constituencies or trade unions, they get the chance to put their points across and they get the chance to speak up in the ways that, on the issues that they care about and give us the advice that they think we should follow. But ultimately, it's us, the government, the Parliamentary Labour Party, that don't have the luxury of ducking the difficult choices and decisions. So we've had to make those choices. And let me tell you, people would not thank us if we ducked the difficult decisions and then the country paid a much heavier price down the road.
Liam.
That's where the Conservatives took us. We're not going back there again.
What will your readers think?
So on the winter fuel allowance, I've been out speaking to pensioners in Liverpool this week, and what's interesting is there is a diversity of views on it, because there are people who say there are a lot of wealthy pensioners who don't need it, but there are too many people who are just above that pension credit line who are really going to suffer this winter. So I don't think it's necessarily about the policy as a whole. It's whether it could be slightly rejigged, because there's just that layer of people who are going to find themselves very vulnerable in the winter.
Zoe?
Yeah, it's a tricky one as a standalone policy to assess as well, because obviously the government went very early with it. There was a bit of a vacuum of news over summer, so that then filled the airwaves about responses to. I mean, in general, means testing benefits is a good thing to do. Of course, there are always going to be losers, and then there are going to be losers who are on those margins, and we should worry about them this winter. But really, we need to wait till budget to see what government plans in other areas to pensions to see the overall effect of those changes.
I think one of the great ironies is that it probably won't save that much money now. It was originally going to save £1.4 billion a year, but in part to placate some of the people who are so angry about this, the government is pushing very hard to get people to sign up to that much neglected pension credit, which the Institute for Fiscal Studies says will probably quite quickly negate the savings anyway. But the big point here is that Labour are not giving in to the people who are calling for this. Actually, the parliamentary rebellion on this was much more significant, albeit very small. That was where the kind of real opposition to this policy lay. Labour was successful, the leadership, in making sure that actually we didn't see this vote happen earlier on in the week, for example, when it would have been much more damaging to Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor. And so for that reason, I think people won't be particularly concerned about this today.
They can't reverse the first very difficult decision that they've taken. So politically, that's just not going to happen.
No, well then let's talk about another area. Are you coming for working age benefits? Keir Starmer said yesterday and hinted in that speech, we will do everything we can to reduce worklessness. Are you coming for those benefits?
Not in the way I think you're hinting at. I mean, there's two things really on welfare. One is, of course, there's always fraud in the system, and of course that's got to be tackled. But more substantially and more significantly, we have nearly 3 million people in this country
the numbers
who are both
stark.
off work and off sick. And it's my responsibility. It's not the fault of those people. They're stuck at home off work. It's the fault of the previous Conservative government that the NHS has not been there for everyone when they need it. So it's my responsibility as the country's Health and Social Care Secretary to get the NHS back on its feet so that we can get people back to health and back to work. And that's how you bring down the benefit bill.
Does that mean coming after working age benefits in that?
The best way to cut the benefit bill is to get people off sick back to work, and that's by getting them back to health, and that's my responsibility. It's the responsibility of the NHS, and it's why I set out today our plans to, as we deliver the 40,000 more appointments and we send crack teams of clinicians with great experience of busting the backlog into
we're going to do a whole section on health.
We're going to focus on those areas with the highest levels of economic unemployment and health-related unemployment.
All right.
So that we can get people both back to health and back to work.
What about the trade-offs, though, more broadly? One of the specifics in the speech and also in interviews that Keir Starmer did afterwards were about things like pylons and prisons. Let's have a look at the Daily Telegraph here. It says, Keir Starmer, prepare for more pylons and prisons, perhaps near where you live, because we need to deal with these things. And also businesses should prepare to employ less foreign labour over time. But the question, I think, is there are even some Labour MPs opposed to developments in their local area. Jenny Riddle-Carpenter, Labour MP for the Suffolk Coastal, attended anti-pylon protests in her constituency. Ben Godsborough, Labour MP for South Norfolk, has also expressed opposition. The theme again is, if you want to take the country with you, but you can't even take your own MPs, how's it going to happen?
It's one of my favourite bits of the Prime Minister's speech.
Oh.
Because...
What, pylons and prisons?
Because, not particularly because I came into politics particularly thinking about pylons and prisons, and actually I spend all of my time mostly thinking about patients, to be honest. But because what the Prime Minister did is something I haven't seen from our political leadership in Number 10 for some years now, which is to say to the country, if you want a brighter future, you can't pretend there's an easy road to it. There are choices, there are trade-offs, and it is because your former Prime Ministers have not been honest with you that we end up with government by gimmick, sticking plaster politics, short-termism over long-termism, and that's why Britain's in the mess it's in, and we're not going to carry on like it. So there is the tough love. I love the Mirror front page today, tough love, and as the Health Secretary, you don't always like the taste of the medicine, But I tell you what, you're a lot better off taking it than going without.
Well, we'll find out, won't we? But what about, again, the political opposition? And there will be when it comes to these sorts of planning decisions in constituencies.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard a lot about how fragile the Labour coalition is. One of the reasons, I think, why Labour will find this difficult is because many of these MPs have quite small majorities compared to what we would typically see in Parliament. So they are going to be much more responsive to their constituencies. They are going to be mindful from the very beginning of trying to keep their seats. And many of them say to you privately, I'll be spending a lot more time in my constituency than perhaps some of my predecessors did. So I think that is a key problem that they need to be aware
Can I
of.
offer some advice as someone with a majority of
was gonna say this one.
528? As I've always said in my election campaigns, you may not always agree with me, but you'll always know where I stand. And look, it's a perfectly legitimate thing for constituency MPs to speak up and voice the opinions, the sentiment that their constituents
But you're going to
expressing.
bulldoze through that opposition.
But you've also got to think what is in the real interests of not just my constituency, but also the country. And it's not ducking the difficult decisions, it's not sticking plaster politics, it is taking the difficult decisions now to beat a path to a brighter future for our country. That's what we're going to do.
They're going to need a lot of bulldozers, aren't they?
Well, we saw on the eve of conference the announcement about planning passports, loosening up the planning system, and there was a lot of support for that. In places like Liverpool, there's 14,000 people on a waiting list for social housing. There's people desperate for homes, and they're talking about densification, using brownfield land, and where the default setting is yes, if it matches standards. I think that's a really positive thing, because otherwise you're not going to build those houses.
Can I just say on welfare, I think this is a very difficult decision, and it is fascinating and in danger of being overlooked how big a thing it is that Labour have gone with this at conference. It's something that Tony Blair tried to do early on in his premiership, the welfare revolution. It was very difficult, and it was something that was pretty quickly shelved, actually. It was a problem for Labour at that time. And on sickness benefits in particular, it is important to say that economists don't actually really know why the UK is an outlier compared to other countries on this. The Office of Budget Responsibility last year, for example, found that NHS waiting lists actually don't necessarily contribute to the inactivity that wouldn't necessarily solve it. So it's important to say in that context that majoring on this is going to be quite difficult if you can't bring those numbers down.
I mean, I would just come in on the sickness causing unemployment point. I mean, there's massive variation across the country. Here in Liverpool, healthy life expectancy is 58. That's 7 years before you retire. You're expected, on average, to get sick before you retire. I mean, it's a state of affairs, we can't continue with. But my sense is the emphasis was very much on, improving the health of people in order to get that welfare bill down rather than the other way round. And that's when we've got to look at the prevention agenda, because that's the thing that's really going to make the difference.
And it's really important that this is done compassionately. For too long, when I was reporting under the Tory government, there was demonisation of people on benefits, demonisation of people who relied on disability benefits, humiliation. This has to be done compassionately. It has to take people with it along the way, and I'm sure that the government is considering that.
Well, this is a good point to refer back to Wes Streeting's speech on, of course, the NHS. Let's have a listen to part of it.
We're sending crack teams of top clinicians to hospitals across the country to roll out reforms developed by surgeons to treat more patients and cut waiting lists. And I can announce today that the first 20 hospitals targeted by these teams will be in areas with the highest numbers of people off work sick, because our reforms are not only focused on delivering our health mission, but also moving the dial on our growth mission too. We will take the best of the NHS to the rest of the NHS, get sick Brits back to health and back to work. That's the difference a Labour government makes.
Where's these crack teams of top clinicians? Who is he? Who is he? He's got a better voice in that clip than he has now.
A lot better this morning than he does now.
The crack teams of top clinicians into areas with the highest numbers of people off work sick. What are you talking about?
So basically, in some of our leading hospitals, we've had consultant-led clinical teams use effectively Formula One pit stop style techniques to reorganise their clinics to go through procedures a lot faster than they normally would. So in one London hospital, for example, on a single Saturday, they did more procedures in a single day than they would normally do throughout the working week. And so we're going to take that advice and expertise and send it around the country, right across the country, but starting with those areas with the highest levels of people.
Have you got these teams together already to come here, for example?
We are already tapping people on the shoulder, pulling those teams together, because it's so important. And back to Liam's challenge, which I absolutely take. Is, look, someone who grew up where the benefit system was putting food in the fridge and money electric meter, I know how important social security is. but no one wants to live a life on benefits. And what really upsets me is that there are people stuck at home, off work, off sick, because the NHS wasn't there for them. And I'm determined to do my bit to get them back to health and back to work.
We've heard the start figures here in Liverpool from both Zoe and Liam, but there is an overarching question, Wes Streeting, and that is about your mantra that we've got to do reform first before any more money. Can that really be true? Are you being honest with people? If you look at the figures, 3 million people, as you said, out of work due to ill health, a 500,000 increase in 2019 on 2019. Office for Budget Responsibility says the cost of sickness and disability benefits will increase by £30 billion in the next 5 years. You're going to need more money.
I've always said it's investment and reform that delivers results. And if anyone's in any doubt about that, don't just look at the record of the last Labour government that delivered the shortest waiting times and the highest patient satisfaction ever. Look at what the Conservatives did after 2019, where they poured more money into hospitals without reform, so there's more staff but lower productivity. That is not the way to deliver modern, effective healthcare in our country.
Hang on, so can you do it without more money right now? And I'm talking significant amounts of money up front.
I think we need to be investing in prevention at the same time as reform, and our IPPR Health and Prosperity Commission, that I know Wes knows very well, suggests, investing in interventions at the local level, empowering local leaders to take those decisions, to respond to whether it's the housing or whether it's the dirty air. The actual things that are happening on a place level to help people live healthier lives. So we need that at the same time.
Come in as a big agenda, whether it's in Greater Manchester with the health powers that are there and stopping people from having to get through the door of A&E in the first place.
But it will need millions of pounds of upfront investment and money, and they're not pledging it.
Can I just say on this, though? Firstly, the budget and the spending review is coming, and the Chancellor spoke at the weekend to the Sunday Times about her priority around the NHS. But can I also gently say, especially to NHS leaders, that yes, we've got to make a good pitch, and we will, to the Chancellor for the investment linked to the reform. But we do also need to look at the almost £200 billion that's currently being spent in the NHS. And it's my observation that because of the size of the investment in the NHS, the debate is often about where do we spend the billions, and therefore they overlook where do we spend the millions. So as well as trying to get the investment linked to the reform we want to deliver, I am also actively looking at where the money currently goes to make sure we get real value for money out of the system. Because to Liam's challenge, every penny I get out of the Chancellor in the spending review or the budget is a penny that could have gone to housing, a social determinant of health, or to poverty, the biggest social determinant of health. So I've got a responsibility to my colleagues around the cabinet table, especially against this bleak economic backdrop and the fiscal challenge in the public finances, to make sure that I'm delivering value for money. Investment, yes. Reform, absolutely. And value for money underpinning both.
But the situation is critical right now. I mean, that report that was commissioned for Lord Arid Darzai to have a look at, a surgeon, a former health minister under the last Labour government, he said £37 billion. There's a shortfall in capital expenditure on NHS buildings and infrastructure, whether it's equipment or whether it's buildings. We can probably look in a moment at some pictures of hospitals that are literally crumbling now. And he says without that, here we can have a look at these pictures now, and they are pretty striking. There's in Torbay, and I think there's one St Mary's, there you go, I think in Paddington in London. And you have a look at these buildings, you can't quite believe these are hospitals where patients are being treated. I have too, actually, quite recently. And you have a look at that, and he says that money has been siphoned off to day-to-day spending. He says without the billions to repair those hospitals, your outcomes and your productivity is not going to improve in the NHS.
And my response would be, I absolutely agree with Ara's diagnosis.
So you need £37 billion.
I would also just say we can't turn around 14 years of capital underinvestment in one go.
But you will need money.
And what I'm focused on, the spending review, is to make sure we do the capital and tech investment in a way that brings down that ballooning deficit in the day-to-day spending. And that is why, by the way, we need a reform agenda that is about public service reform, public health reform, and why, unless we do both, not only do we not address the challenge of today, we don't address the challenge the OBR set out, which is that the NHS will effectively go bankrupt because it will become unsustainable in the longer term. And that's why I will not reverse gear on NHS reform, and people who are briefing the
Yeah, but
newspapers
he-
saying that
you
I'm
won't-
going too far on diagnosing the problem, that saying, oh, I'm wrong to say the NHS is broken, they will kill the NHS with kindness, and I'm not going to back down
But the
on reforms.
problem
Unless we do
is-
it, we won't deal with the crisis today,
But-
and we won't have a sustainable NHS
Yeah, but
for the
Ari
future.
Darza is saying unless you literally fix those buildings, you won't be able to do the reform. I mean, that's the problem, that he is saying that this is actually central to the reform that we're just hearing from West Streeting. It can't happen without it.
No, and I mean, I think the investment conversation is something that many of us have wanted to have here in conference, and we've had hints of it at various points. There's been suggestions around changes to fiscal rules while we've been here. As I said earlier, we have to wait until the budget for that, and we also have to wait until the 10-year plan next year, the big NHS plan, before we hear about that. So the part of the problem, I think, for Sir Keir Starmer here in Liverpool has been that on the basis of this fragile election coalition, so much of his political capital is based in this unique capacity to deliver, this unique appeal that he is able to deliver for the British people, and that's in part on account of his background, he says. He has promised that we will see that, and I think unless you see those results, people do start questioning that, and that's kind of the problem of timing here that is going to prove quite difficult.
Well,
for
and you've paused the hospital building programme. You've paused that. So you've paused that. You're going to wait and see what happens over the next year or so with your reform programme before you actually are able to tackle these sort of intrinsic issues in terms of crumbling infrastructure. And we're going to wait even longer.
Because on the hospital programme, I walked into the Department of Health in the first week to find that the timetables were works of fiction and the money was running out in March, which is why we're reviewing the timetable and coming forward with a realistic plan. But I would just gently say to your profession...
When will it come, though?
But this is part of the challenge, right? So as soon as the review is complete, we'll publish it and we'll come out honestly and set out the plan. But here's what I gently say to your profession and the nature of this conversation. You drag us as politicians to short-termism and to gimmicks with exactly this kind of discussion. And we're not having it. We'd rather take a few knocks in debates like this and conversations like this to make the tough long-term decisions than to do more government by gimmicks. People knew we couldn't turn the NHS overnight.
About the NHS?
Clear about, no, you didn't break the NHS, the Tories did. No, but look, before the general election, we were clear that change would take time. The public know that. Yeah. I am also clear, make no doubt about it, I have got to take our party into the next general election with lower waiting lists and easier access to GPs, so people see the improvement and they give us permission to finish the job as part of a decade of national renewal.
So are people going
I know
to
the responsibility
Are people
I've
going
got.
to it? It comes back to that initial question on this programme. You're not going to be able to carry people with you. Here in Liverpool, I'm sure hospitals need repairs now. And what I'm trying to say is, on the evidence that we've got from experts like Ari Darza, is that you won't be able to achieve what this government is saying without more money. Fill that shortfall. Fill that shortfall investment. Stop siphoning off to day-to-day spending.
I mean, of course, that's why Keir and his team are talking about a decade of national renewal, because these things, as Wes said, they're not short-term fixes. But I did take a little bit of hope from Rachel Reeves's speech, actually, earlier this week, when she talked about investment and the stranglehold at the moment that the Treasury has on the way investment is scored, so that actually it's very difficult for the government to make investment in public services and for the OBR and others to then say, yes, that will lead to growth and then greater tax receipts in the future. If we can change that and relax those rules and allow investment to be scored differently, then perhaps Wes might have a little bit more space than he thinks.
More borrowing. That's the answer, isn't it? Perhaps if Rachel Reeves, the Treasury, can be persuaded to loosen those rules, borrow more to do the upfront work, you'd support that.
I would support anything the Chancellor says, because I know where my bread's buttered. So.
Where I would agree with Wes is the sort of perils of our parliamentary system is this kind of short-termism. The problem we've got, and we've seen time and time again, we saw a lot under the last government, very short-termist, because next thing you know, there's a new electoral cycle and a new bunch of MPs coming in promising different things and different agendas. What Labour's challenge is they're still operating within that system. And so you can talk about a decade of national renewal, but it is a fairly flimsy voter base in some ways. So you're right, these are big projects, £37 billion, that's not going to happen in 5 years. So obviously you've got to convince the voters that that is worth sticking with for the long term.
Alara, one of the other things is the sort of digital revolution that we hear both from West Streeting and obviously the Science and Technology Secretary of State, Peter Kyle, that actually it will save money in the long term. But actually, if you look at this fiscal risks report, snazzily titled by the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, it didn't reflect the confidence that West Streeting has that technology will reduce the cost of delivering, because it concluded improved technology would actually help health outcomes, but it would actually increase costs overall.
Well, I think this is a fight to come for Wes. There's absolutely no doubt about it, and something that he will be talking, I'm sure, a lot with various stakeholders about in the coming months, something we will be focusing on as that 10-year plan approaches. That is definitely going to be a key flashpoint in reforming the NHS, and there's no doubt about it. And on the question of short-termism, voters in numerous studies are more responsive to promises that they will have gains in the short term. That is just true. But one of the reasons why they're not responsive to promises that are in the longer term is because they don't trust that those gains will actually come about. So that is
They haven't seen it, they haven't
that's the
felt it,
biggest
yeah.
problem that the government will have, is actually being able, and you heard it from Keir Starmer, it is a real dilemma that he'll have to fight with, and we need to wait to see how the public respond to that, is do they actually trust him when he says you will have these benefits in the future? Because the reason that voters don't trust it is actually that they have quite good reason to say if something takes place over a much longer time, with many different potential politicians looking at these different plans, it can be seen as much less likely that the gains will actually come good.
Right, and then there is funding just overall. I mean, I was talking to someone from the Nuffield Trust a week or so ago. She said that the UK is about mid-table when it comes to overall spending on health. So we are spending less than comparable countries like France, like Germany, like Belgium. They have a different way of funding their health service. Are you going to at any point look at other models of funding to help fill the shortfall?
I have looked around the world at other healthcare systems, and my conclusion that the reason why the NHS is underperforming today isn't because it's a public service, publicly funded, free at the point of use. Actually quite the opposite. In the world of genomics, AI, machine learning, big data, that NHS model is fit for the 21st century in a way that Attlee and Bevan would never have predicted in 1948. But you look at where the money goes, it's a lack of investment in primary care, community services, mental health, social care, diagnostics, which is why, as part of the reform agenda, we want to shift out of hospital into the community, from analogue to digital, and from sickness to prevention.
But do you accept
so we make
we
the right
are
long-term
mid-ranking
decisions.
in terms of our spending? We spend less than those countries I've just said, and we also have mid-ranking health outcomes. Spend more, have a different model, we get better health outcomes.
Well, one of the reasons why we have prioritised economic growth as the #1 mission of this government is, as the last Labour government showed, if you get the economy growing, you can invest in our public services and put money back into people's pockets without having to raise a single penny on taxes in other areas. That is the heavy price we are paying for low growth, low productivity. That was the Conservatives' economic record. And we are not going to carry on with the
West
status
Streeting,
quo.
you've just said you won't put the investment in order to get productivity and those better health outcomes up front. Without it, be honest with people here that actually you'll have to pay more in taxation, you'll have to have a social insurance scheme, or you'll have to accept these slightly mid-ranking health outcomes. It can't be none of those.
Well, as I've warned Labour conferences year after year now, if we don't do the reform, both on the public service reform agenda and on the public health agenda, then the NHS will go bust over the longer term. And I'm not prepared to leave that as this government's legacy. It's my job to lead a team of almost 2 million NHS staff across the country to put our shoulders to the wheel so that we can be the generation that took the NHS from the worst crisis in its history, got it back on its feet and made it fit for the future, and that is exactly what we're going to do.
But you could be honest also and say, well, we should all put our hands in our own pockets. More people are, according to the figures, to pay for physiotherapy, mental health treatment. Would you advocate that we just do that a bit more in the meantime?
Well, we've got a two-tier healthcare system in this country the Conservatives have opened up, where those who can afford it are paying to go private,
Well, actually,
and those who can't are being
really
left
afford it are
behind.
doing it.
And people are borrowing, which particularly worries me. That's why I've said I'm going to give patients choice. Where there is spare capacity in the private sector, we will use that spare capacity on NHS terms to bring down waiting lists, because I don't think that it's right that working class people are left behind while those who can afford it or insured to do it go private. That will help us in the here and now. In the longer term, it's my ambition to rebuild the capacity of the NHS so that it's there for everyone.
And your
when they need
ambitions
it.
are clear. It's the reality when you look at where we are in those tables with comparable countries. And perhaps none of those options are palatable, but are we going to have to go for one of them?
Well, I think, even within the current model, we need reform and funding at the same time, let's face it. I don't think these are mutually exclusive options. And, you know, moving to a more preventative system to help build the NHS fit for the future in years to come will be, in our book, the most important thing for the government to focus on.
We had a protest outside the conference today about general practice. You know, if people can't get to see their doctors, as you've talked about before, they're playing that 8 a.m. lottery to try and get a GP appointment, and then they're ended up through the hospital door when actually they don't necessarily need to be there. So I think that the primary care is absolutely essential in this, and we've seen a bit of a breakdown in that sector. I think people will be relieved to hear, particularly in places like this city, hear Wes say that, you know, he's looked around and it's a free at the point of use is never going to be, hopefully never going to be in danger, because there's an increasing number of voices that we hear, particularly on the right, who are absolutely obsessed with this idea of an insurance-based
But do you think people are happy then to accept worse health outcomes?
Well, this is the trade-off, isn't it? Because where's the money coming from? That is the question that everyone's asking for. So you need investment now. If we have another winter like we have, you know, we report every winter on harrowing scenes in the NHS. Hospital corridor care has become an absolute normality. I've been sent pictures of plug sockets that have been set up in corridors because that's just where people have to be now. You know, and it's not the Labour government's fault that the NHS is in that situation, but if we have another winter of those images, the pressure increases.
But do they have to be more honest about what the realistic options are?
Well, I mean, Keir Starmer's speech yesterday was an attempt to talk about trade-offs, and there was a hint, wasn't there, when he said that people expect good public services with lower taxes. I think many people would have read into that a suggestion that a difficult conversation on something like this will come. And on the primary care point, I think it's completely right that when we talk about AI and diagnostics, for example, you've seen this in rural parts of America, that it's all well and good diagnosing people with diseases, but then you actually do need people that are actually going to be capable of treating them. And so that is part of the round of this big, big problem that Streeting and others will be thinking about.
Well, let's talk about joy, or perhaps the lack of it, if this Labour government has been accused of being killjoys. Let's have a look at some of the headlines. The Daily Telegraph: pubs could be forced to shut early in new Labour nanny state blow. The BBC has this headline about outdoor smoking ban at pubs being considered, Prime Minister. And finally, The Guardian, well, we were talking about prevention. It says junk food TV ads to be banned pre-watershed in UK from October 2025. Are these things going to happen? Are pubs going to close early, Wes?
I think I've demonstrated my commitment this week to late night licensing.
You are on a one-man mission, aren't you?
But look, we are looking seriously at a range of measures we can take to make sure that, as well as living longer, we're living well for longer. Because the tragedy is today we've got too many people living longer but becoming sicker sooner, which is bad for the economy, bad for the public finances in terms of the cost to the NHS, but also, because I've not been entirely institutionalised yet by the Treasury, I don't just think of people as economic units, really bad for quality of life. And I don't know about you, but when I'm in retirement, I don't just want to look back on a life well lived. I want to live life to the full until the very end. And that means we have to take action today on public health. And by the way, I don't want to do things to people. I want to do things with people. This is a shared mission. We've got to work with business, civil society, and all of us as citizens to build the healthy nation that we want to see.
Is Keir Starmer a killjoy?
I should probably declare an interest here as someone who spends a lot of time in pubs, particularly here in Liverpool. And I think it's important to think about, yes, a life well lived, but people enjoy going to the pub. They have a social aspect. You know, there's loneliness involved. And also, you know, Liverpool is an example of a city where hospitality has rebuilt its economy. So you need to think everything that the pub owners and the people in those businesses went through during COVID. I think it's really important that you think about pubs are closing every day.
May I just say, I think, you know, government's role is to create the kind of conditions that people can live safely and securely and find joy in their own lives in their own way. It's not to provide an entertainment show, as we've seen, you know, in recent decades. So I do think, you know, we've got to stick to the basics that the government can provide and kind of leave people to do the rest. But that said, I think guiding people, whether it's to healthier lives through reducing smoking or reducing alcohol consumption, is only a good thing. And actually, taxes that can be raised on those areas can be then reinvested into people's lives, into localities, to help them lead healthier lives. So I don't think we should shy away from the government having a bit of a guiding hand in that respect.
Interventions are good, but just keep the pubs open.
Well, I think Wes has confirmed that they're not going to be shutting early. But higher taxes on these sorts of things to nudge people. There is a nudge unit, or certainly was a nudge unit it to persuade people to change their lifestyle?
I think the sense I get is that the public are receptive to measures like these when they think they are actually going to work and improve public health. So if you look at the sugar taxes, for example, we've seen news today that obesity has stabilised, some rates have stabilised, particularly among younger people.
Although
and
it's
there
still
is
very
evidence,
high,
they are
isn't
still
it?
extremely high, but there is evidence, particularly among young women, for example, that interventions like that work. When it comes to the idea that smoking could be banned outdoors in pubs, I think people will look at that and say, I actually want to be persuaded that that is going to make a difference to bringing down rates of smoking, avoidable cancers, etc. I think that's where the scepticism comes in.
And actually, in a rare cross-party note from me at a Labour Party conference, what George Osborne did on soft drinks has had a real impact. And what I'd say to people on the right who tend to be more libertarian in these areas is think about the cost either to the exchequer or to people's pockets if we don't take public health seriously. And when we talk about the mission of this government to build a healthier society, yes, it's driven by a Labour government, but I actually want this to be a genuinely national mission, and I want to see voices on the centre-right and the right of British politics speaking up in this area, because George Osborne, it's not often I'm very praiseworthy of him, but he showed leadership in this area. And I think there are people on the right who do want to work with us, and the hand is extended to work together to build a national consensus on public health reform.
All right, well, let's have a listen to some of Keir Starmer's speech about how he does enjoy himself.
Giving every community the breathing space, the calm, the control, to focus on the little things they love in life, not the anxiety and insecurity we have now. Because we do need joy. We do need that in our lives. And one place that has always done that for me, Conference, I told you about it last year. It's the Lake District.
The Lake District. Where do you find joy, Wes Streeting? Apart from Labour Party conference, of course.
The pub. I mean, I find joy going to theatre. I mean, going to cinema when I get the chance. I loved that part of Keir's speech where he talked about. I mean, that bit was funny, especially when he talks about the woman who, she known as a politician, would have threatened to push him down the stairs, which is where I think lots of people are on politics at the moment. But there was also what I really loved as well was when he talked about playing the flute and listening to classical music, because I don't think the rich cultural heritage that we have in this country and in countries around the world only belongs to people from privileged backgrounds. I love the fact that a Prime Minister from an ordinary working class background was able to talk about his love for playing the flute and his love of classical music. I thought that was brilliant.
Yes, what did you make of the sort of cultural bit of the speech? It was towards the end, I guess, yesterday. Really enjoyed that bit.
Yeah, I thought he did. I mean, he lost me a bit at Shostakovich, but, you know, I'm
I
not a
think
classical
you're not
music
the only one who
aficionado.
might be lost with a bit of Shostakovich.
I think it's really important to say that the arts, and, you know, it always used to depress me when Rishi Sunak sort of denigrated the arts and said that everyone just had to learn maths, because I did an arts degree, and I think that arts can lift people up, and as Wes says, people from working class backgrounds. You know, you've got Keir Starmer talking about the flute. Andy Burnham's previously talked about listening to the Smiths and the lyrics of Morrissey that kind of made him understand that it was kind of cool to be intellectual. And I think that can really open your horizons and give you a new outlook on life. And it shouldn't just be the preserve of the middle classes.
Should he have spoken more about it? Some people said they would have liked to have heard more of that and perhaps less of the beginning of the speech.
Yeah, it's something when you talk to some of his advisors that they will say is that he's given interviews before, though definitely not as many about music and his like for music as he has about his love for football, for example. And you do have some in Labour who say, actually, when he talks about things like that, it does make him sound like somebody who you could have a chat with about these things and they would want to. Obviously, Labour has a curriculum review coming up. These are not insignificant decisions that they'll have to face, and certainly it could be a war that they'll face with the Tories quite soon. We'll see.
Your takeaway from the speech and conference, Zoe?
Yeah, I mean, I think the party has turned a bit of a corner, and the fact that the Prime Minister was able to relax into his speech and talk about personal things, which I know perhaps isn't the thing that he goes to as his number one pitch, was a good sign. So, you know, but a lot of pressure now on budget to really come up with the goods.
Right. I mean, is the balance right, though? Oh, there you go. They really are dismantling around us. We've only got about 50 seconds to go just to rise above the noise. The work of change has certainly begun. Maybe we should finish that. I hope we have provided a bit of joy on Politics Live here this week at the Labour Party conference. Everybody will be getting ready to go. Just before we say goodbye, why. News that you can now listen to Politics Live if you're out and about on the live news stream on BBC Sounds. Just go to the live dial at the top of BBC Sounds homepage and tap on live news. And of course, I will be back in London, trains permitting, tomorrow for more Politics Live at 12:15, and then we will be at the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham from Sunday, programmes Monday to Wednesday. Thank you. And maybe it's inappropriate for me to say, I think the pubs are open about now, aren't they? For everyone to go for lunchtime. From all of us here, bye-bye.